scream in the dark. In the small town of Wilsford, where everyone knew each other and every house seemed to hold calm and silence, strange and inexplicable things had begun happening recently. People started to disappear. No one could explain why or where these people were going, or why they never returned. Maria, a young woman who had recently moved to Wilsford, immediately sensed that the town harbored a dark secret. She was new, but she had already heard rumors about an old abandoned building on the outskirts, a massive house that had been standing empty for many years. The locals became silent whenever this place was mentioned, and some were even afraid to approach it. One evening, after another disappearance, Maria decided to learn more. She could no longer stay on the sidelines, as her heart told her that these events were closely connected to that building. Ignoring all warnings, she was determined to uncover what lay behind these horrifying occurrences. She headed to the building at night, when everything was quiet, and only the shadows of the moon illuminated the decaying walls. Already at the doorstep, Maria felt her bones grow cold. The air was dense, and even the ground beneath her feet seemed to repel her from this place. Yet she kept moving forward. When she entered, her eyes could barely distinguish anything in the absolute darkness. Then, against the shadows, a strange and ominous scene began to emerge. Old furniture scattered across the floor, broken windows, and most terrifying of all, walls on which strange, almost incomprehensible symbols clearly appeared. They seemed to be written in blood. A faint sound echoing from the darkness seemed to speak to her, causing her heart to beat faster. Suddenly, in a dark corner, she noticed something moving. Something alive. But before she could understand what it was, the sound of quiet footsteps echoed from behind. Maria turned around. There was nothing to be seen, but her heart told her she was not alone. Feeling her hair stand on end, she continued moving forward. The sound of her footsteps blended with the fog. And then, amid the ruins, she saw an old chandelier hanging by a thread, as if ready to fall. But it wasn't that which caught her attention. No, in the place where an old moldy painting once hung, she saw a person. It was standing there, motionless. Maria held her breath. The person standing before her was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, as though they had stepped out of another era. Their face was dim and unreal, as if time had never touched them. And although the eyes of this person were empty, she felt their gaze as if it passed through her. Do you want to know? The voice was cold and muffled. It wasn't just a question. It was an invitation. Maria stood still, clenching her teeth, feeling her knees begin to tremble. She couldn't answer, but she couldn't flee either. Her body seemed paralyzed by fear. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't. There was something so powerful in this darkness that she had no choice but to become a part of it. At that moment, she heard quiet footsteps behind her. She turned around. She saw how the shadows began to grow denser, forming shapes that increasingly resembled the people who had disappeared from the town over the last month. Maria realized she had fallen into a trap. These people, these shadows, they had become part of this house, this building, this forgotten place, and now she too was part of this dark history. There was no choice. She was now a part of something far more terrifying than she could have imagined. And now, every time someone disappeared in Wilsford, that person didn't just vanish. They became part of this dreadful story. Maria stood in the darkness, feeling the cold seep into her bones. Her heart was pounding so fast it seemed it would burst. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. The people she had seen were part of this place. They had long since become its shadows, its prisoners. The shadows of those people began to draw closer, and Maria felt the air grow thin. They weren't alive, but not entirely dead either. They moved smoothly, silently, and each step they took echoed in the silence like distant thunder. They all stared at her, and in their eyes was something desperate, as though they were begging her to do what they couldn't. "This is not what you think," a voice came again, and this time it was much closer. Maria turned around and saw the same person who had stood before her. His face was still smudged, unnaturally pale, but his voice now carried a new tone, as if he were trying to calm her. "We can't get out of here. You're next." Maria took a few steps back, but her legs seemed to be glued to the spot. She couldn't move. Her mind tried to gather itself, but fear overwhelmed her like a flood. What did he mean? Why had she become part of this nightmarish trap? And why couldn't these people escape? She knew she couldn't leave this place without an answer. It seemed as though everything was part of a larger sinister plan, one that encompassed not just her, but everyone who had ever ended up here. And she knew that these people, these shadows, wanted something from her. They wanted her to stay. They wanted her to become another part of their grim history. Maria abruptly turned and began running toward the exit, trying to carve a path through the ruins, avoiding the dark moving forces. She searched for a door, for any way out of this place. But each step seemed harder, as if the earth itself was trying to hold her there. She saw light at the end of the corridor. At first, it seemed like just a figment of her imagination, but with each step it grew brighter and clearer. She knew this was the exit. This was her chance to escape. But as she neared it, she saw dark figures emerging from the light, something that looked like scars on a human body, and they were far too real. "You can't leave," one of them said, its voice sounding like the rustle of old film. "You're already part of this place. And if you leave, we'll find you. We always find you." Maria fell to her knees, her heart breaking with terror. She realized that this house, this criminal forgotten corner of the world, it would not let anyone leave. Its shadows, its prisoners, they were all part of something much older than she could imagine. And suddenly, everything grew quiet. The shadows disappeared. The light went out. And Maria realized she was no longer alone. She had become part of this place, part of this endless nightmare that lived among the ruins of Wilsford. Since then, there were no more disappearances. All those who came to this building became part of its dark truth. And where those people had once stood, only shadows remained, waiting for the next victim. Maria could not believe that she had become part of this place, part of its dark legacy. She couldn't understand how it had happened. Just moments ago, she was an ordinary person searching for answers to the terrifying disappearances. Now, she was in what felt like another reality, a world where time had no meaning, and the past and future blurred into one dark, unknowable whole. Her body no longer belonged to her. She could feel it. Her limbs were growing heavy, and her vision blurry. This place was beginning to absorb her, transforming her into a part of itself. And like all those who had come before her, Maria had lost her freedom. And this was what happened to all who stayed here. The shadows began to influence their minds. They couldn't leave, but with each passing day, they became a part of this old house. They no longer remembered who they were and gradually forgot why they had come here. All they felt was fear and anxiety, as if an invisible force was repeatedly asking them why they hadn't left yet. "You're not alone," the voice came again, sounding like wind seeping through cracks in the walls. Maria turned around, but saw no one. "You were never alone." She tried to scream, but her voice didn't echo. Instead, she felt her hand move automatically toward her chest, as though she were no longer in control of her movements. And then she saw it. On the wall, directly in front of her, blood began to appear, not dripping, but forming itself like a stream of energy, painting symbols on the wall, becoming clearer with each passing second. Maria stepped back. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. These symbols began to dance before her eyes, as if they were communicating with each other. They formed images, faces that looked at her in horror, and dark eyes that were not human. She felt each image penetrate her consciousness, as if they were taking her soul. "This is not your place, Maria," the voice came again, now so close it felt like it was in her ears. And suddenly, everything went silent. Her body stopped responding. All that was left was the emptiness she had fallen into. There was no return from this place. She realized that these symbols were not just drawings. They were her pathways to an endless cycle, one that trapped people who had ever stepped into this place. It was a trap that drained their humanity, leaving only shadows, forever locked in the same room, in the same house, unable to break free. Maria began to move back, though she couldn't control her steps. She walked as if she were a puppet, guided by an invisible force. And there, at the end of the corridor, she saw them, the people who had become part of this dark trap. They stood silently, staring at her with their empty, hollow eyes. "Are you Free? One of the figures asked, its voice barely touching Maria, like a cold breath from another world. Maria didn't answer, knowing they couldn't hear her. She wasn't free. She was part of this place, just like all of them. You will become part of us, another figure replied, and they all moved closer to her. They had no physical features, no traits that indicated humanity. They were nothing but reflections, shadows, parts of this great dark machine that lived at the heart of this house. Maria began to feel her mind weakening. She could no longer understand what had happened to reality. All thoughts, all emotions, all remaining memories seemed distant and cloudy. And each step, each movement she made, was no longer hers. Her last memory was how the darkness enveloped her body, how she disappeared among the shadows, becoming part of this terrifying world that no longer had boundaries. And from that time on, anyone who approached this place only heard silence. But inside that silence, they could feel a presence. The presence of someone who had once been alive, and who had now become yet another reflection in this dreadful house. The night passed slowly, and although the house seemed dead, it lived inside, silently consuming the body and soul of anyone who dared to approach. The shadows, now part of this place, wandered the corridors with no purpose other than to observe those who entered. Maria could not understand how much time had passed since she became part of this horrific cycle. She felt her consciousness slowly fading, but one thought remained clear. Something in this trap needed to change, or they would all be cursed forever. But what that change was and how to bring it about, she did not know. Then, on one of those dark nights, when dreamlike visions clouded her mind, she saw him again. The man she had first encountered, the one who seemed like part of the building itself, faceless and without a past. He stood in the place where she had first encountered the shadows, and though his eyes were gone, his gaze still seemed to be fixed directly on her. "Do you still think you can escape?" His voice sounded, and this time it was less muffled, more human, but still filled with a terrifying uncertainty. "You, like all of us, are already part of this place. In trying to flee, you only confirm that you belong to us." Maria felt her heart tighten in fear. She wanted to ask what he meant, but her voice again disappeared, as though she had no right to express her thoughts. She took a step back, but the man continued to stand before her, unmoving. "You don't understand, do you?" His words were hazy, yet their meaning was sharp and piercing. "We have all become part of this house. The moment you step over its threshold, you cannot leave. You have no choice but to become what we are. A shadow. A forgotten echo that has no end." Maria lowered her gaze, and in that moment, it seemed as though the darkness began to envelop her, swallowing all her thoughts, all her emotions. She began to feel a coldness emanating from the very heart of the house, and it seemed to seep into her soul. Her consciousness grew heavier, and her body felt empty, as though it no longer mattered. But something inside her would not let her fall completely into this darkness. She couldn't, and didn't want to, remain just a shadow, part of this dreadful cycle. "If I can't escape, then at least I'll try to change this," Maria thought, and with all her might, she tried to bring herself back to consciousness, to the world she had left behind, hoping to find a way to salvation. She felt her mind begin to fight against the shadow, as she struggled to recover the remnants of her will. Suddenly, like magic, it felt as though the walls of the house began to move. They were not just objects standing still. They were alive. And with this movement, the very atmosphere began to change. The shadows that once seemed formless now had outlines, their eyes glowing with red light as they drew closer to Maria. And suddenly, the voice came again, cold, muffled, and ominous. "We are your dreams. We are your worst nightmares, the ones you could never forget. You long ago left your reality, and there is no way back." Maria screamed. She didn't know if this was her last attempt or if she was just giving in. But there was still a place inside her for the fight. She couldn't allow herself to be taken by these dark forces, to become just another reflection of this place. She took a few steps forward, as if tearing herself toward freedom, and for a moment, the darkness seemed to recede. She understood. This house was not only ominous, it was alive. And anyone who tried to escape became part of it. But if she could find a way to awaken this house, if she could bring forth the dark force hiding within, she would have a chance at salvation. And that chance, a tiny spark, burning in the dark. But would she be able to make it happen? Or would she still be part of this endless dark game of the house? Maria couldn't take her eyes off the door, which was slowly closing behind her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized she could no longer turn back. She was trapped. But this was not just a physical trap. It was a trap of the mind, slowly consuming her consciousness. It seemed as though the walls of this house had come alive, and every crack, every gap in the wooden panels was a channel through which dark forces awoke. She felt it inside herself, the cold that couldn't be cast away, and the darkness that shackled her soul. She was no longer just a human being. She had become part of this anomalous living structure that sought to pull her even deeper into its bowels. Each step she took echoed dully off the walls, as if the building itself were waking up, silently surveying its new victim. The shadows began to move behind her, leaving no possibility of escape. Suddenly, in the darkest part of the house, as Maria tried to find even the smallest crack in a window to get outside, she heard a familiar, ominous voice. It was the voice of the same man who had appeared before her several times, and each time his words grew more unsettling. "Do you think this is the end?" His words tore through the darkness. They had no boundaries. They came from every crack, every dark corner. "This is just the beginning. There is no end here. There is no way out. You are already with us." Maria fell to her knees, trying not to lose consciousness. Thoughts began to swirl in her mind. She felt her awareness cracking, the darkness gradually dissolving her sense of reality. And then before her appeared another image, more terrifying than all the previous ones. It was a face not human, but eerily similar to a human's, stretched features, inverted eyes that didn't move but still seemed to stare at her. And that gaze pierced her to her very heart. "We have always been with you," the figure said, and its words penetrated every cell of her body. "You came here on your own. You chose this. This was all meant to be. You have long stopped being an ordinary person." Maria felt her lips tremble, her hands clenching involuntarily, but she couldn't speak. She wanted to scream, but her voice was gone, just like her last attempts to resist this terrifying, endless dark cycle. "You are part of this world, just like us," the voice added, and Maria saw other faces emerging from the darkness. Faces without eyes, lips, or features. They all stood together, watching her, and in their faces, there was nothing human. They were outcasts of this world. They were shadows, just like her. All these faces spun around her, turning her into the center of this relentless circle, which was tightening more and more. And suddenly, she realized that she had become that shadow, that she was starting to transform into a faceless part of this horrifying reality. She lifted her head and saw the walls begin to dissolve, stretching into dark, endless tunnels. The shadows became more visible. They moved, pulling her, their hands cold, their breaths like the sound of gunshots echoing in the emptiness. "You don't understand why you're here, do you?" asked the voice again, now in her ears. The sensation that the house was trying to consume her, leaving nothing alive, completely enveloped her. Maria could fight no longer. The darkness began to consume her entirely. But just before her consciousness finally faded, she saw one last image. The same house, once alive and real, now empty and dead, just like all those who had entered it. But now it was not just a house. It was its essence, its heart, devouring everything that came near. And she had become part of this terrifying mechanism, part of the endless game that this house played with all who dared to enter. And so, everyone who stepped into this place, and everyone who tried to escape, ultimately became part of it. For this house was not just a physical object. It was a living reflection of an endless dark force that ensnared all who fell into its trap. And Maria had become just another embodiment of this darkness.